Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like strong and touching stories from the Wild West. Here we talk about love, pain, courage and fortitude against the backdrop of endless prairies and harsh times. Each video is a piece of the past, in which destinies come to life. Make yourself comfortable. Ahead is the story of a rancher who lived alone. Until one day he found a bound girl in the thicket. We're getting started. In the heart of the wilderness, where there were no churches, no signs, no roads inhabited by wheels, there was a small piece of land, cut off from the rest of the world. There, at the foot of the dusty mountains, among thorny bushes, snaking trails and steep slopes, stood a lonely ranch. It was built by hands accustomed to work and a soul tired of pain. Its owner is a man who was called by few people and was known even less. He wasn't looking for company. And yet, he lived every day, not for someone, but in spite of. He once had a house in another state. Wife. Son. Laughter in the house and the smell of bread in the morning. But all that disappeared on one of those days when fate turns so sharply that not a single person remains the same. He did not wear mourning, did not talk about the past, and did not keep anything that would remind him of what he had lost. Everything was buried deep, somewhere under layers of dust, time, and silence. Now every day of his life started the same way. At dawn, he got up before the sun was shining and went out to the cattle. A horse, cows, an old dog on the porch, that's his whole social circle. He rarely talked, even to himself. Everything that needed to be said had been said long ago by the wind blowing between the rocks and through the dried-up riverbeds. The earth here did not tolerate the weak, but he survived, simply because he had no reason to die. The food was simple: beans, corn, and sometimes dried meat. The water from the spring behind the hill is cold and clean. And he spent his evenings by the fireplace, staring into the fire, as if he could find answers in it that life did not give. And yet, in this harsh, scorched loneliness, something broke one day. It started with a little thing, something he hadn't seen before. Returning from a belated check of the fences, he noticed broken branches in a narrow ravine below. Neither deer nor wolf broke them. There was another drawing there, not an animal. It was as if someone was making their way through the bushes, hurriedly, not understanding the path. The footprints were blurred, as if they had passed an hour or two ago, but there was a human weight in a ragged rhythm of movement, uncertain, desperate. He stopped at the edge and listened. Just the wind. No footsteps, no voices. But down below, in the dry grass that clung to the remnants of the snow, he saw something else. A torn ribbon. A fiber lost among the grasses, stuck in a knot. And there's also a depression in the ground that looks like a footprint from a bare heel. Briefly, almost invisibly. He was not a curious person. But in this region, no one just walked. And he certainly wasn't wandering alone. Something told him it wasn't an accident. It's a call. When he returned to the ranch, he found no peace. Neither the coffee nor the fireplace flame calmed the uneasy feeling. The earth seemed to have changed. The silence was no longer comforting, it now rang like before a storm. And deep inside him, where everything had long been burned to ashes, a spark of what he himself would not dare to call hope suddenly lit up. The night passed uneasily. The rancher barely slept a wink. Lightning glinted through the cracks in the shutters, and the wind blew dust across the roof, as if knocking on the walls with a warning. He was lying on his back, staring into the darkness, as if waiting for something. By morning, he already knew what he would do. As soon as the sky turned gray, he saddled his horse and headed back to where he had noticed the tracks the day before. The ravine seemed deeper than he remembered. The bushes sagged from the night's rain, the path was slippery, and the whole ground resembled a pit into which the remnants of summer had been dumped. He dismounted at the edge and began to descend slowly, pushing aside branches and peering into the penumbra. His heart was beating unevenly, not from fear, but rather from a vague premonition. And then, around a bend in the path, he saw her. The girl was lying on her side, facing the ground, as if she had been thrown away like a rag doll. Her hair, black and matted, was plastered to her temple. The thin body was wrapped in rags soaked in mud. Her wrists and ankles were bound with coarse ropes, so tightly that blue stripes could be seen under the skin. There are traces of old cuts on his legs. His face was pale and scratched, and his lips were cracked from thirst. She was unconscious, but her chest was barely rising. He froze. The wind blew the dry leaves past, and they rustled over her motionless body, as if wanting to wake her up. She was a girl, young, with features that suggested the Seminole tribe. They hardly ever appeared in these parts, and if they did, they stayed away from the whites. But no one brought her here voluntarily. Someone brought it. And left it. He bent down without thinking. With his sharp blade, he cut the ropes on his wrists and legs. The knots were tightened with such malice, as if whoever was knitting them wanted not just to tie, but to destroy. The skin under the ropes was covered in blood. He didn't know her name, who she was, or why she was here. But it didn't matter. She couldn't stay in this pit alone. Not in this condition. Not now, when even nature seemed to be turning against all living things. The wind blew from the sky again, and the first drop fell on his forehead. The storm was returning. He picked her up in his arms, carefully, as if she were a fragile vessel. Light, almost weightless, she clung to him in an unconscious dream. Her skin was as cold as mountain water. He climbed back up step by step, holding her tightly, not looking around anymore. The rain was lashing my face. The horse waited at the edge of the cliff, nervously shifting its hooves. He put the girl in the saddle in front of him, covered her with the cloak and turned home. Through the rain, mud and gusts of wind, he led the animal along slippery trails, not thinking about the distance. All that mattered was that she had to survive. When they reached the ranch, the sky was leaden, like before the heavens collapsed. He carried her inside, into the silence of the wooden walls, where the fire crackled in the fireplace. He laid her on the couch, threw a blanket over her, and checked her breathing. It was weak, but steady. His face remained pale, but a faint vein twitched at the corner of his mouth. He stood next to her, peering at her. Dirt, bruises, traces of fear, everything said that she had been through hell. And yet, under all the dust and pain, he saw something in her that he couldn't explain, strength. Not pity, not weakness. Something else. As if, even bound, she wasn't broken. She opened her eyes for a moment. Brown eyes, slightly clouded, as if they still didn't realize where she was. And at that moment, their eyes met. Neither of them said a word. But in this silence, where even the wind died down behind the walls, the first contact took place between them. Without language, without explanations, it's like being between two beings who have experienced loneliness. There was no fear in her gaze. There were no questions in his mind. Just a short spark. A silent promise. The house was filled with silence again, but now there was something new in it, presence, breathing, life. The girl remained weak, hadn't said a word since the day he found her. But he didn't ask any questions either. Their silence was not empty, there was more in it than words could contain. She was lying under a thick blanket on a wooden cot near the fireplace, and he was slowly doing everything that was needed. He carefully cleaned her wounds of dirt, applied medicinal herbs brought from the mountain slopes. Her skin was covered in bruises, abrasions, and thin cuts, but she didn't complain. Sometimes she flinched when the pain became acute, but quickly froze again, watching his hands. He gave her warm water with honey, fed her soft bread and broth, which he cooked over coals, and waited every time until she ate at least a little. He found an old woman's dress, which he had once kept in a chest, and sewed it, thread by thread, on quiet evenings under the light of a kerosene lamp. The fingers are rough but precise. He hardly looked at the fabric, he did everything by touch, as if remembering how he had done it before, when he was still not alone. Then he carefully placed the finished dress on the edge of her bed, without saying a word. She noticed everything. Not immediately, not openly, but with a glance. He could feel it. She began to rise slowly, first sitting down, covering herself with a blanket, then taking a step to a chair by the window. He always left a cup of tea next to her. Sometimes I returned to the house and noticed that the cup was empty. It meant more than any words. She accepted his care. Sometimes she stared at him for a long time, not taking her eyes off him, when she thought he wasn't noticing. There was something wary in those looks, but it was no longer alien. She was still in her shadow, but she was peeking out. He knew that. I didn't rush it. He just kept being there. The winter wind howled outside the windows. The mountains were shrouded in fog, and snow fell in short waves, falling on the porch and the pines. The cabin breathed warmth, the wood crackled, the light from the fireplace cast soft reflections on the walls. Between chores, he would sit in an armchair by the fire, smoke a pipe, mend a harness, or sharpen a knife. She sometimes fell asleep to the rhythm of his footsteps and the steady tapping of wood on wood, as if this sound was the only thing that gave peace. He didn't try to look into her past. Everything that was left behind the threshold. Here, in these felled walls, there was only the present moment. She was beginning to understand that. Her breathing became more regular, her movements more confident, and her fingers no longer clenched into fists as before. One day, she took a mug of warm milk from his hands. Their fingers touched for a moment. He felt that touch reverberate inside with something warm, alive, almost forgotten. Her silence was not empty, it was filled with trust. Every day, amidst the blizzards and nights filled with the flickering light of fire, something that did not require words was born between them. In this house, where only the cold of memories had lived before, a new silence had appeared. Cozy, lively, human. The snows were gradually melting. Sunlight was already breaking through the clouds, and the hut, wrapped in silence all winter, was slowly absorbing the breath of spring. She got up earlier than usual that day. Quiet as always, as if she was afraid to disturb the air. He noticed how she went to the wash basin, lifted her shirt from her shoulders to wipe herself with warm water. He didn't want to look, but his gaze slid over her back. And froze. There are traces on the skin. Not just bruises, not just scratches. They were scars. Old, deep, straight, as if left by a whip or belt. Silent lines of pain, scorched by time. They couldn't have appeared by accident. And he suddenly realized that her silence was not just from fear, but from horror, from the hell she had experienced, which was not talked about. Something tightened in his chest. He turned away without making a sound. I went out on the porch, sat in my old armchair and stared at the mountains. My fingers clenched into fists, and fragments of past years began to pop up in my head. Paintings that he had been trying to shut out for a long time, how camps were burned, how women were dragged along the ground with chains, how children were taken away, and men were shot. He had witnessed such scenes. He saw how white people, with medals, crosses, laws, created horror in the names of civilization and order. She was in front of him now. The Seminole. With a shadow in his eyes, with a past in which no one was supposed to survive. He knew she hadn't just been abandoned. She was being held. She was running. From somewhere where she was considered someone else's property. Where they branded the bodies without distinguishing between the living and the dead. He imagined how she could have been caught, tied up, punished, and his heart was filled with gloomy anxiety. Such people do not forgive escape. If she's escaped, they'll be looking for her. This means that his house may be in danger. He had been alone for too long, and he wasn't expecting anyone. But now she's here. And with it, her past. And what had once been far away to him, like a shadow from a campfire ballad, now breathed nearby. And it could rekindle the flame. He didn't say a word to her. He just silently brought her fresh linen and dry herbs and went to the hearth, where he rekindled the fire. In the evening, he closed all the windows and double-checked the locks on the door. For the first time in many years, he did not sleep in bed, but at the entrance, with a hard drive in his hands. Not because he was afraid of her. But because he knew that fear does not come from within. He always comes from outside. The snow finally came off, and the earth began to breathe. The air began to smell alive, decayed foliage, moist earth, and the first sprouts. Streams bubbled at the foot of the hills, and the birds, which had once been silent all winter, once again burst into ringing whispers. That morning, he was awakened by an unusual silence in the hut. There were no light footsteps, no sound of water in the pot, or even breathing against the wall. At first, his heart was squeezed with anxiety, but then he saw that the door was ajar. He went out onto the porch and froze. She was standing barefoot in the grass, where the stream went into the forest. Her slender fingers slid over the tall shoots, as if she were trying to remember the touch of the earth. Her hair, heavy and curly, was spread over her shoulders, and her face was turned up to the sun. It wasn't running or being confused. It was a comeback. He didn't call out to her. I just stood there, watching. There was something almost fabulous about her at that moment, not a girl from pain, but a woman walking on the edge of a new life. From that day on, she went out more and more often. In silence, as before, but with new gestures. She began to help, cautiously at first, as if afraid to do too much. Then, more confidently. She fed the chickens, carefully, in her own way. She was filling a bucket by the well, even though it was almost waist deep. I gathered herbs on the slope, dried them in the shade. Sometimes he found himself staring at her for too long, simply because she exuded a strange peace. They still hadn't spoken. But it was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of agreement. There was no shadow in her gaze anymore. And in his face, rare, awkward shadows of a smile began to appear. When she splashed water from buckets and accidentally doused his raincoat. Or when she took the egg away from the hen, and she raised an unprecedented cry in response. He suddenly laughed. For the first time in many years. Every day he noticed changes not only in her, but also in himself. He started going out into the field with her, showing her how to fix a fence. I gave her simple tasks and waited for her to do it. He put the kettle on beforehand, knowing that she would return with an armful of fresh mint. He even cleaned the old saddle, even though he hadn't ridden since the fall. She didn't ask. But one day, as she was passing by, she put her hand on his shoulder. Light as a feather. And there was everything in that touch: gratitude, trust, and what he didn't dare call hope. Spring has come into its own. The earth lived, and they lived with it. Not the old ones. And not who they could be. And those who have become, who have stood by. Spring brought with it warmth, hope, and a sense that evil was behind them. The hut breathed tranquility, and in every movement, in the way she adjusted the drying herbs against the wall, as he stacked the firewood, there was a fragile but real harmony. But the tranquility of the frontier is always shaky. Especially when it seems too full. He noticed it first. Nothing special, just a trail. Alone, a stranger, near a stream. It was too deep, with a slightly sloping spot in the sock. The step was fast, almost cursory. He squatted down and peered intently. A man passed through here recently. Not a local. And not him. He knew every trace of himself. This one was a stranger. Then there were torn branches, as if someone was hiding in the bushes, or watching. And one more detail: a broken fir branch stuck into the moss, like a mark left for yourself or for someone else. He walked around the edge of the forest, moving quietly, as in those early years when hunting was not for the sake of game, but for the sake of survival. And then he found it, an old, rusty horseshoe. It lay among the stones, as if accidentally dropped. But he knew that you don't just lose things like that. Especially on trails where no one rides. It was a sign. He didn't say anything to her, didn't show it. But in the evening he spent more time at the barn, checked the old traps in the bushes, checked the powder in the cartridges. The moon was rising over the mountains, and the wind carried the warm scent of the heated earth. It would seem that everything is as usual. But inside, everything shrank. He didn't sleep last night. He lay motionless, feeling the silence stretch like a thin string. Then, at first, a faint, barely perceptible light. Somewhere far away, over the hill, as if from a lantern. Then the second one, a little closer. And the barking. The one you hear not from wild animals, but from dogs trained to search. She woke up on her own, as if she felt it. She sat up, trembling, and her eyes were wild. He knew immediately that she had found out. That look wasn't from fear. From memory. He stood up without saying a word. He took the rifle from the shelf and checked the cartridge. Then he covered her with his old blanket and led her to the trapdoor. There was a basement behind the hut, dug by her father. He hid it there, indicating with a gesture, silence. When he closed the hatch and threw an armful of hay on top, his chest ached. He knew it could happen. I knew it from the day I first saw the scars on her back. But I still hoped she would be safe. Here. With it. He stayed outside. He walked to the edge of the field, where there were dead trees. He sat down by an old tree stump, rifle in hand, eyes on the horizon. There was more light. Now he could see 3 lights moving like a snake through the hills. They were walking. Not in the direction of the road. Towards him. He didn't know how many people would come. I didn't know who exactly they were looking for. But he knew one thing: he wouldn't give her up. No way. Not under any circumstances. They came before dawn. While the sky was still black, and only the first faint gray began to spread over the mountains, the footsteps became reality. First, the creak of a saddle, then the thud of hooves. 2 on horseback, 1 on foot. The one in front carried himself confidently, like a master returning for what he considers his own. He was already waiting. Hidden at the edge of the barn, the rifle lay on a board, an eye in the gap between the boards. My heart was thudding, as if a war drum were pounding inside my chest. He recognized this man, tall, in a long black coat, with a whip on his belt. He had never seen his face or his voice before, but he recognized it from her scars. It was he who left them. There are 2 men behind the stranger. One with a rifle, the other with a long knife on his hip. Their faces are restrained and cold. The mercenaries. They work quickly and silently. He had seen such people before, in the distant years on the border. Such people cannot be persuaded. They can only be stopped. When they got closer, he fired the first shot. The bullet hit the ground next to the front horse, kicking up dust. The stallion reared up, the rider cursed and almost fell. The panic began. A second shot was fired, and one of the mercenaries fell to one knee, clutching his shoulder. The horses neighed and raced towards the barn. The panic turned into chaos. The one in black screamed and set fire to the dry straw by the barn wall. The flame went up, scarlet and insatiable, crackling in the wind. The fire seized the edge of the roof, the smoke began to suffocate. He moved behind the coop, grabbed the sawed-off shotgun, and came out from the rear. The fight was as short as a flash. Gunpowder, a scream, a blow. One mercenary was already dead, the other was crawling away with a bloody leg. But the one in black was confident, as if he knew he was going to win. When he rushed forward, shooting, the cowboy managed to shoot, but too late, the bullet cut off his shoulder. He collapsed to the ground, his breathing lost, and the world began to swim. But at that moment, something changed. She appeared from under the barn, amid the smoke and flames. She was covered in ashes, in hay, with disheveled hair, in an old dress, with eyes full of horror, but not for herself. For him. She was screaming. For the first time. Her voice cut through everything, the silence, the smoke, the distance. She was calling his name. As if she could bring him back to life with that scream. And he stood up. He was on one hand, staggering, clutching a rifle, but he got up. He made eye contact with the enemy. The man's face twitched. In that moment decided everything. One accurate shot and silence. The remaining mercenary did not wait. He dropped his weapon and disappeared over the hill as if the devil was behind him. It was just the two of them on the ranch, in the smoke, among the flames, among the horses, thrashing in fear. She ran up to him, knelt down, hugged his neck, and did not let go anymore. He felt no pain. Only the warmth of her hands, the trembling of her body and the beating of her heart nearby. For the first time since the night he'd found her in the thicket, he realized that she belonged to himself now. And maybe a little bit for him. The fire of battle that had been ignited on the ranch had finally died out, leaving behind only smoke and silence, piercing and heavy, as if hanging over their destinies. He was lying on the sheets that she had found in an old trunk, his shoulder was throbbing with pain, and his breathing was heavy and ragged, each breath was accompanied by stabbing discomfort. Wounded and exhausted, he seemed barely alive, but she was there, relentlessly, like an angel sent by fate. Her hands, gentle but firm, gently touched the skin, applied bandages of herbs and leaves gathered in the meadows in early spring, medicinal and ancient, knowing how to heal not only the body, but also the soul. The nights in the cabin stretched out like an eternity. The wind was howling outside the window, and a faint candle flame was flickering in the house. She did not take a single step away, constantly watching him, as if afraid of losing the one who had become her last hope. There was determination in her gaze, patience and care in her actions, without a single word. Their silence was filled with meaning, as if each gesture spoke more than 1,000 words. In the darkest moment, when it seemed like the pain was about to consume him, she broke the silence for the first time. At first, softly, with a slight tremor in her voice, she said her name softly, almost like a prayer. His eyes, half open and tired, slowly met hers. There, in the depths of the dark pupils, he saw a story full of fear, pain and loss. She talked about her past, about the Seminole tribe, about those terrible days when chains bound her, when she was deprived of freedom and hope, when no one believed that she would survive. Every word is like a wound, open and bleeding, but also a door to a new beginning. He listened without a single objection, without pity, but with understanding and quiet pain in his eyes. There was a spark of sympathy and promise in his gaze. She would never be alone again. For the first time in many years, his heart began to open up, and in this quiet exchange of feelings, something more was born than just gratitude or duty. A tender feeling arose that was alien to his lonely life. The nights turned into sunrises, and with each new day, his strength returned. Supported by her care, he began to get out of bed to face the new world. Stepping out onto the porch of the hut, he took a deep breath of the fresh air, filled with the scent of wet grass and spring flowers. Around him, where fear and loneliness had once reigned, a new life now reigned, a life where he was not alone. She stood next to him, barefoot, with a slight smile that lit up her face and spoke of rebirth, of hope, of the future they would build together. Their silence, filled with a new meaning, was a strong promise to walk side by side, no matter what. The spring wind played with her hair, as if approving of this tender union of two lost souls who had finally found each other. With the onset of spring, the land around the hut was awakening to life, and with it their common future was awakening. They decided to leave behind the old walls, dilapidated and fragile, and set about building something new, a solid and reliable house that would become a refuge and a symbol of hope for them. Here, on the edge of a wild prairie, where the air smelled fresh and the horizon stretched to infinity, a new chapter of their lives began. Every morning they met the dawn together, he in a leather jacket and a wide, brimmed hat, she with long wavy hair gathered in a simple braid and a dress, now without those spots and tears that accompanied her first days at the ranch. Their silence was filled with understanding, they didn't need words to feel each other. He took an axe and a saw, smoothly sawed logs, and she, no less diligently, helped, laying wood, carrying water, putting pegs for future walls. Each of their gestures was imbued with a new strength, a new desire to build something more than just a shelter, to build a house in which their hearts could find peace. Sometimes she stopped, bent over the ground, picked herbs and flowers, put them in small wicker baskets, and he watched her with a quiet smile. In those moments, she seemed even closer to nature, to the land from which she was born and which gave her strength. Spring, with its light winds and warm sunshine, gave them not only warmth, but also joy, the very lightness that had not been in their lives for a long time. Every day their house grew, the sturdy logs became walls, the roof was covered with straw, and the ground around them was filled with their footprints, gaps for fences, and a place for a chicken coop. Together they built fences, not just protecting the house, but symbolically separating themselves from the past, from pain and fear, leaving them behind. Laughter, long forgotten and rarely heard, returned to their days as if by magic. He caught her gaze, in which playfulness flashed, and involuntarily smiled, feeling the weight of loneliness begin to subside. She responded with a light touch of her hand, confidential and gentle, for the first time in a long time. One evening, when the sun was already setting, they finished building the porch. The girl took out a beautiful feather from her modest reserves, light, with smooth curves, tied to a leather cord. She hung it on an upper beam, where the wind could sway it and the light of the golden hour could illuminate it. This feather became a symbol of her roots, her strength and the freedom she found here, next to him. When the last light of the afternoon sun merged with the first stars, they stood side by side, looking at the horizon flooded with colors of the sky. There was so much that was said without words in their gazes, gratitude, hope, the desire to be together, no matter what. This silence was fuller than any speeches, stronger than any vows. The house on the edge of the frontier has become more than just a place of life, it has become a place of healing. A house built on trust and silence, on common labors and tenderness, on those crumbs of light that they found in each other. The wind played softly with a feather on the porch, reminding them that freedom is not just a word, but a state of mind that they have been striving for all their lives. And even if the words hadn't been spoken out loud yet, even if the stories hadn't formed into legends yet, their shared life already spoke volumes, about love, strong and quiet, about a home where two hearts found each other and found peace. Thank you for being with us in walking this path together, from loneliness to a house built by silence. If you like the story, don't forget to like and leave a comment, it will greatly support our channel. Subscribe so that you don't miss new touching stories from the Wild West.